welcome back to Hope Beyond the Broken. We are here, Sarah. We made it another week.
Another month.
Another month.
Oh my God, another month already.
Yes. Well, I'm Damaris, and I already gave you her name.
Sarai.
And so we decided that we wanted to continue this pod, giving you some more information about us. I know we hinted a little bit about our background in the first couple of episodes, but today we wanted to talk a little bit about our mom, our dad, a little bit about our upbringing, just so you guys can get to know these ladies. Like, who are we and why we even have a pod and what are we talking about? So we're so excited to bring you guys on that journey with us.
Yes, very exciting.
And so our parents are from two different backgrounds. Absolutely. My dad was raised in Puerto Rico in a very poor environment. And at an early age, he hit the streets, and he came from a very abusive home. His dad was an alcoholic, and he, at the age of 15, 16 years old, ran away from Puerto Rico and ended up in New York. And in New York, being homeless and not knowing a lot, not knowing the language of English, back in the 70s, there was a lot of gangs. And he was approached by a gang, and he was initiated into a gang, and they made it seem very easy to get in. However, when he went there, they told him that they were going to put him what they call a line of fire. And the line of fire was homemade weapons. One of the weapons was like a bat that had like fish hooks on them. And so they said, we're going to throw you in that line of fire, and if you make it through that line of fire, you're in. My dad got ready to go into that line of fire, and when he went to get into the line of fire, he was thinking, hey, the first hit, I'm just going to drop to the floor and then I'm in. And so unfortunately, they brought a girl into their space, and they said she was a traitor. And so they threw her on the floor, and they told my dad that there was another thing that we're going to have him do. He was going to have to set this girl on fire. That's so shocking.
It is.
To think about that right now, would somebody say something like that is very shocking. However, in the 70s, the gangs were so violent that at that point, he was now in a place where there was no door for him to run out of.
Right.
He has no money, he has no friends, he has no family. And now he is stuck in a place where if I leave, these people are going to kill me. So he's like, hey, what is a match going to do to this girl, right? But while they're talking to him, they give him the match. He throws the match, and the girl starts catching on fire. And he's kind of dumbfounded because he doesn't understand how just one match will make the girl catch on fire. Unfortunately, they had put some accelerant, and as soon as she started getting on fire, they kicked her. She rolled. They kind of put the fire out, but the deed was done. And at that moment, my dad was like, I can't believe what's happening. He was in so much shock that actually something was happening. And that quickly went away the minute somebody started patting him in his back and telling him, good job. All of a sudden, he had friendships. He was being showed appreciation. There was a sense of belonging that he felt at that time. And the enemy just used that to lock him into that place where he was needing that love and attention and needing something to be a part of. And the enemy used that place, that platform, to just cheer him on. You did a great job and stuff like that. Along that time, my dad wasn't in the gangs for very long, probably about 3 or 4 years. He was in the gangs, but in the middle of being in the gangs, they were doing drugs, and they were pimping women, and they were selling drugs, and they were fighting people, and all of these things. And my dad went from selling drugs with the gangs and being in fights and everything to using the drugs. And it got to the point, my dad, they used to call him Afro. His hair was like super big and long and luscious, and they used to call him Afro, and his hair started falling off. And he went to a doctor, and they said, well, you have hepatitis and all of these other things. And he started losing his hair, started getting kind of yellow. And they said, you have to get off the streets. You have to get off from the drugs. Our dad, and the only reason why we know this information is because my dad's ministry started with him giving his testimony. So I have been listening to his testimony since I was little. I was at the foot of any altar, wherever he was preaching or anything, listening to his life story for over 25 years. I listened to his testimony. So his testimony is stamped in my memory and in my heart. And so now that I'm older, I think back to all the things my dad went through, but I see it with a different perspective now that I've been through my own things. But at that time, that doctor says, you need to get out of the streets. You're never going to have children. You're going to die, or somebody's going to kill you. And my dad asked a friend to let him stay with him and detoxed. And his friend was like, well, I don't want no trouble, Afro, you can't stay here in my place. I'm not about that. He's like, please let me, just don't open the door. Let me detox. And this is one of the attempts my dad did on detoxing and changing his life. And he stayed in a friend's room, and within 48 hours, he was hallucinating. He was having withdrawals, for anybody that knows about addiction. And he started having suicidal thoughts. And there were a couple of floors up. And my dad was like, I need to stop hurting. I don't want to be this way. And he attempted to throw himself out the window. But God had another plan for him. And my dad basically just hung, half of his body inside the room, half of the body outside the room. And he said, if I do one more attempt, I'll fall over and I'll die and this will end. And instead he fell back into the room. And when he fell back into the room, he's like, I just don't want to live anymore. And he took the blood and he put it under the door. As my dad tells us in his testimony, he put it under the door and told his friend, I'm dying. You need to help me. My dad came out of that and he stayed in the streets. And a lot of things happened within those times, but his encounter with the Lord was, they were in the streets and they used to offer protection. And my dad is asking one of the ladies in the group and is saying, hey, where's that music? Has anybody told us about this? Did we get our money? And one of the guys said, no, we didn't get any money. He said, okay, so we're going to tear that place up. And so they go into the second floor. And when they arrived to the second floor, it wasn't a club. It wasn't a party. It was a church that had just opened. And they were saying things and they didn't understand what was happening. And they were like, well, you know what? It's a bunch of squares. Let's get out of here. Right? So they were going to leave, the people from the church, because they're like, we're not going to mess with these people. We're going to leave. And my dad says that he felt like his feet were nailed to the ground and he could not move. So at that point in his mind, he's like, okay, I can't move. I'm shaking. What am I going to do? And at that moment, one of the ushers came by, and my dad took his gum and put it in the guy's ear and turned him around and pushed him back into the church, because the guy was telling them that they couldn't be making noises and doing these things. But my dad could not move, so he was trying to distract himself and make a mockery of what was happening at the back of the church. But he says that they let this woman come to the altar and she started preaching about a book in the Bible. My dad was like, oh, they were saying slurs and saying stuff across the room.
Like she's making a fool
of herself and stuff like that. And then all of a sudden she changed from talking about whatever she was talking about and started talking about how she used to be a prostitute and a drug addict, and how she used to steal and beat her mom to steal her money. And my dad and the people, part of the gang, were yelling at her, she's lying to you guys. She's trying to take your money and everything like that. But my dad says that he was just trembling. So he asked one of the girls to give him a cigarette. And he's trying to smoke and he couldn't smoke because he's nervous. He's shaking. He says that his feet kind of loosen up and he's like, bet I'm running out of here. And when he went to do about face and turn around, he actually ran to the altar. And he says that when he reached the altar, his knees hit the floor. And he started seeing his life just going right in front of him, right? His life was just coming as a movie of all the mistakes he has made and what everything has been going on in his life and all these things. And he says, my dad used to say, he just started saying, God, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. I don't know what's going on, but I can't continue being this way.
Mm-hmm.
And he says that from one moment he was trying to run out of there making fun of these people, to in another moment he is on his knees saying, God, I don't know what to do. I need your help.
Mm-hmm.
And then he's jumping up and down because he feels this freedom come over him. And so my dad, after that, went into a rehabilitation program. And so after he went to rehabilitation program, he met my mom. And so Sarah's going to tell you a little bit about my mom, because my dad and my mom were total opposites.
Totally.
Opposites completely.
Yeah.
Personality-wise, the ways they were raised, everything was very different.
Very
And so we wanted to share a little bit about how my dad was. He was a personality that was like bigger than life. My dad was extremely charismatic. A lot of my traits I get from my dad. He was a storyteller. He was a theologist. He was a man of God. That God had a calling on his life that the enemy just wanted to rip from the very, very, very young age. And so that's one of the reasons why we wanted to share some of their information, so you know where we come from. We come from a family that is extremely diverse, parents that were very different, and then God called them into ministry at some point. So Sarah's gonna let you guys know a little bit about our mama.
So my mom was, I always said that she was a walking angel on this earth.
Yeah.
She could do no wrong.
Yeah.
In our eyes.
In our eyes.
Like she said, my parents met each other when my father was in a rehabilitation program, and my mom was a volunteer in the women's rehabilitation program. And I guess their path crossed at some point while they were in that rehabilitation program, when my father was rehabbing and my mom was being a volunteer. And I believe mom was 19 or 18 at the time. I think they got married when she was 19.
Yeah.
And so they met each other and they started dating, but once it was time to tell my grandma about the whole situation of them dating, my grandmother was not having it.
She's like, no.
She was like, no, you guys, that's not going to happen. Because my mom was born and raised in church. She didn't know anything about the world. She never stepped into a club. She never drank. She never cussed. I never heard my mother cuss. My mom was completely angel.
She was very different.
With imperfections and everything, but she was definitely a role model. So my grandma, she was against it at the beginning, but then they managed the way to, they were praying about it, and that was God's will. So there was nobody that can stand, against that at that moment. Yeah. So, my father did what he needed to do, which it was gain my grandma's, faith, affection, and respect, and trust him and stuff like that. So, and he actually did, they were best of friends. They loved each other. But it was pretty hard for them at the beginning.
It was
at the
very
beginning.
Hard. Yeah.
So after that, they got married. I think like a year and a half.
About a year.
They didn't last too long.
No, they didn't stay single for too long. They got married and then moved to Boston.
So then they got married, and God called them to evangelize.
Yes.
They were. My father was preaching. My mom would sing, and then they moved to Boston. When they moved to Boston, God calls them, after a few years, I think, of him preaching, he calls them to minister as a pastor. So that's when they became pastors. We were very young.
I was 11.
Yeah, I was very young. I don't remember, but I was young.
Yeah, I was 11 when God called them to pastor. And the funny story is about that, when God called my dad to pastor, and he told my mom. He said, God is calling us to pastoring. And she said, well, he hasn't told me nothing yet.
How about when he said, God told me that you're going to be the mother of my children and my wife? What did mom say?
She said,
He hasn't said nothing to me yet.
That was her answer to everything. Well, God hasn't talked to me yet. He told me nothing yet. So my dad stayed on his toes. And every time he prayed, he's like, but you're going to have to reveal it to her, because she is not going to just take, but she is not going to. she was a woman of faith
and
prayer.
Yes.
And so she was not going to do anything that God wasn't telling her directly. He's like, okay, all right, I'm going to follow you, but if God says so.
Exactly. So eventually, you know, God spoke and they became pastors. And then we were all very small.
Yeah.
We started with
I was 11.
Yeah, we were all young. Yeah. And then we started with concilio, which is like a concilio.
Yeah, it's like an association. Like Church of Christ and stuff like assembly.
Yeah. Yes. And then after that, 2 years after, I think, or a few years after, my father went independent because the ministry that God had called him was bigger than what people could really understand. Yeah. And that's just what happens at the moment. So my mom was very loving, very nurturing, a queen, an angel. She was, she can speak to anybody and speak life. Yeah. You know, what else? She was very disciplinary too. And she was a teacher. So she had everything, everything that someone can imagine great in a woman, she had. And she possessed it with pride, joy, and humbleness.
Yeah, she was extremely humble. She was not the opposite was that my dad was very flamboyant. My dad was very loud. He wore his gold watch, his gold jewelry. You know, my mom was like you know that saying, very demure. You know, all of those things. That was my mom. My mom was very conservative.
Very conservative.
She was very conservative, and my dad would buy her suits and stuff, and she's like, I'm not gonna wear it. Like, she wasn't a flashy person or anything like that. She was very conservative. Her demeanor, she was not a person that yelled, but she was a very serious person.
Certain.
So she was very a very assertive person, and so she didn't play. That's one thing with my mom. You can tell you cannot play with her. You don't be joking around. Like, she did not do that because she respected the word of God. She respected her relationship with the Lord. And even though there was trials and tribulations with medical issues, health issues, relational issues, and stuff like that, their foundation with us always was God first, you know, the ministry and stuff like that. And at the time, you know, it was the early 80s because I was 11 when we went into pastoring. So I'm going to say mid 80s because I was in 75. So, you know, but like around like 85, 90. So there was still a lot of the very doctrinated,